a lone figure, trudges through the dense, mist-shrouded pines of Glacier National Park, unaware that beyond the silent hush of the forest lies both danger and deliverance. Lucas has spent the last few months running from memories too painful to face, convinced that solitude is his only solace. Then, in one lightning-quick heartbeat, he finds himself nose to nose with a towering brown bear, an encounter that should spell disaster. But in a twist of fate as unpredictable as the wilderness itself, the beast becomes his unexpected savior. It's a story of fear, forgiveness, and finding unlikely friendship at the ragged edge of survival. The wind howled across the open expanse of Glacier National Park, ruffling the tall grass that sprouted between jutting rocks and gnarled pine trunks. Early evening sunlight slanted through the boughs of the towering evergreens, painting streaks of gold across the forest floor. Overhead, the sky hung like a broad canvas of fading blue, tinged with the promise of nightfall's deeper hues. Birds fluttered between branches, letting out faint calls that mingled with the rustling leaves. Lucas stood at the edge of a narrow trail, a spot not marked on any tourist map. He gripped the straps of his old scuffed hiking pack and tried to steady his breath. In the distance rose the rugged summits of the Lewis Range, their peaks cutting sharp silhouettes against the sky. His heart pounded in his ears, not from physical exertion, but from the swirl of emotions that had led him here. After weeks of living in his car and fleeing from the complexities back home, he had come to this wilderness for one reason: to get lost. The tension he carried in his shoulders was an old companion. At 29, Lucas possessed a quiet intensity that had developed since childhood. Growing up in the outskirts of Bozeman, Montana, he learned early on that life in a small town could be stifling. People talked, rumors spread, and every misstep seemed magnified. More than once he'd found solace outside, in the hush of the mountains. Nature was a confidant that never judged, never demanded. Here, he could breathe in a way he couldn't back in the city. He had come to Glacier National Park because it was one of the few wild places left where silence could stretch for miles, interrupted only by the heartbeat of the land itself. He recalled reading a biography about early park rangers who braved the winter snows with nothing but a canvas tent and a fierce determination to protect these lands. That legacy, that sense of rugged wilderness, both frightened and enthralled him. Deep down, he hoped that out here, away from everything he knew, he might find clarity, or at least forget the aches of his past. In his right hand, he clutched a battered notebook, stuffed with scribbled entries, reflections on his recent heartbreak, regrets, and a swirl of emotion that had driven him to abandon comfort for the unknown. The pages were tear-stained and smudged in places, a testament to many nights spent hunched over a dim lantern. Every so often, he would come across signposts of civilization, leftover campfire rings, footprints on the trail, the flutter of a national park pamphlet stuck under a rock. But for the most part, there was nothing and no one. That emptiness both soothed and unnerved him. He looked up at the canopy, thinking about his mother. She'd passed away the year before from a sudden illness. Her final days had been filled with hospital corridors and hushed bedside prayers. Her last wish was for him to keep living his life with an open heart, to let love in, even when it hurt. He had tried, but in the months that followed, he'd lost touch with that advice, lost in heartbreak from a failed relationship and unresolved guilt about not being able to do more for her. The weight of all of it made him feel hollow. Determined to shake free from his thoughts, he started walking deeper into the forest. Moss clung to the trunks of ancient cedars. His heavy boots, bought second-hand at a local store, sank slightly into the soft, loamy soil. In the distance, the faint sound of rushing water beckoned, and he decided to follow it. He found a small creek, its waters tumbling over smooth rocks and fallen branches, meandering eastward, The hush of the evening grew denser. Shadows lengthened, and he realized he needed to make camp before night fully arrived. He reached a small clearing by the creek, almost a secret hollow ringed by conifers whose dark needles formed a half-shield. Setting down his pack, he laid out a battered sleeping bag and began gathering dry sticks for a campfire. The crisp mountain air held a slight chill, even though it was early autumn. He knelt by the creek to fill his aluminum bottle. Catching a glimpse of his reflection, he saw exhaustion etched into his features. His once bright hazel eyes looked dull, his cheeks hollow, his sandy hair unkempt. The man staring back at him seemed a stranger. He forced a half-smile at himself in the rippled water, then returned to light the campfire. Flames licked the gathered sticks, gradually crackling and rising. He warmed his hands and felt a ripple of comfort spread through his body. The evening deepened, the sky turning from gold to bruised purple. Stars peeked out between ragged clouds. Lucas exhaled, absorbing the primal serenity of the place. A sudden rustle in the undergrowth snapped him out of his reverie. He froze. Could be a deer, he told himself. He'd seen many on the drive here, usually bounding across the road in the twilight. But the forest went silent. No chirping birds, no scurrying squirrels. A deeper hush settled, and a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature coursed along his spine. He stared into the darkness beyond the glow of the fire, trying to discern shapes. Then it came, low and rumbling, a growl, not loud, but deep enough to reverberate in the pit of his stomach. Adrenaline flooded his veins. He slowly stood, trying to look bigger than he felt. In the firelight, he glimpsed a hulking figure between the trees, massive shoulders, thick fur. The breath caught in his throat. A bear. His mind raced. He'd read the park's guidelines. Don't run. Speak calmly. Back away slowly. He had bear spray clipped to his pack, but it felt a world away now. The brown bear sniffed the air. Its eyes glowed with curiosity, or perhaps a wild hunger. The creature ambled forward a step, still half hidden in the gloom. Lucas did everything he could not to panic. "It's okay," he said, his voice trembling, arms half raised. He took a slow step back, scanning for anything he could use as defense if it charged. The bear cocked its head, as though assessing him. Time stood still in that dance of uncertain threat. Heart pounding, he edged his way around the fire, keeping it between him and the animal. Fear welled in his chest, but he willed himself to remember the guidelines. The memory of news stories about bear attacks in the region flashed through his mind, each telling of hikers who miscalculated. Seconds stretched into what felt like minutes. The bear sniffed the air again, made another low rumble, and retreated into the darkness. It was gone, leaving Lucas trembling by the fire, not sure whether to chase it away for good or thank whatever cosmic force caused it to lose interest. The forest came back to life in uneasy waves. He sank to his knees, exhaling sharply, heart hammering. He didn't sleep well that night, half listening for every crack of a twig. Morning light found him hunched by the charred remains of his campfire, eyes rimmed with fatigue. The events of the previous night lingered on him like a wet blanket. Why had the bear appeared? Had he ventured too close to its territory? He decided to move on, deeper into the wild. Packing quickly, he followed the creek upstream for hours, the beauty of the place tempered by the constant sense of watchfulness. The forest changed with altitude. The trees thinned, replaced by rocky outcrops studded with stubborn wildflowers that still managed to bloom in the cooler climate. He scrambled over boulders, crossing narrow ravines. Hunger gnawed at him, but he rationed his snacks, dried fruit, jerky, a can of beans he ate cold. The deeper he ventured, the more he sensed a different rhythm here. Gone were the hum of civilization and the whir of phone notifications. Only the land and him and his thoughts remained. He found a strange comfort in it, despite the fear that lingered from his bear encounter. By midday, he discovered an old ranger station, its logs weathered by time and coated in a layer of moss. A real name was carved on a wooden sign, Swiftcurrent Ranger Outpost, an abandoned building left behind when the park consolidated resources a decade prior. He rummaged around, stepping carefully over rotted floorboards. Dust motes filled the stagnant air. A few rusted tools lay scattered in a corner. Weather-beaten maps pinned to the walls showed an older layout of Glacier's trails. In the remnants of a wooden desk, he found a single can of peaches expired, but maybe still edible. He stashed it, feeling an odd camaraderie with whoever had once patrolled these woods. Late afternoon shadows stretched across the outpost's clearing. Lucas considered staying in the shack for the night but decided against it. The dismal atmosphere unsettled him. Instead, he pushed on. He couldn't escape a nagging unease, like being watched. Every so often, he'd hear a distant crack of branches and freeze scanning the trees. It could have been any number of animals, but his mind always went back to that bear. The notion that it might be following him was enough to keep his senses on high alert. Nightfall approached quickly in the mountains. By the time he set up camp in a sheltered nook halfway up a slope, the sun was already dipping behind the peaks. The temperature dropped sharply. He huddled in his sleeping bag, ignoring the persistent rumbles of an empty stomach. Sleep came in fits. A few days passed in a similar pattern, waking in the cold grey morning, hiking for hours, searching for signs of life and trying to avoid any further bear encounters. The air grew steadily chillier. On the third evening, clouds gathered in ominous drifts and a fine, icy rain began to fall. Lucas scrambled to find better shelter among a cluster of rock formations that jutted from the mountainside like broken teeth. He found a small cavity just deep enough to keep off the worst of the rain and set his pack inside. Water trickled through cracks in the granite, forming shallow pools that reflected the stormy sky. Fatigue weighed heavily on him, and his thoughts drifted to his mother's last days in the hospital. He remembered the smell of antiseptic, the hushed beeping of machines, the comfort of her frail hand in his. "Promise me you'll keep looking for the good in this world," she had whispered, her voice weak but resolute. The memory brought a lump to his throat. Had he truly honored that promise? Hiding away from the world in the wilderness, was that truly looking for the good or just running? Suddenly, a noise brought him out of his reverie, a sharp crack of wood echoing through the storm. He peered out of the little rocky shelter, rain pelting his face. Through the gusts of wind, he saw movement near the tree line, something large. His heart lurched. Although the light was fading, the form looked unmistakably like a bear. The same bear? He couldn't be sure. In these parts, it could be black bears or grizzlies. This one was brownish, robust. A grizzly, most likely. It moved with a lumbering grace, sniffing at the ground, then raising its massive head. Lucas tried to shrink back against the cold rock. Fear drummed in his chest. Why did this keep happening? Why, in such a vast expanse of wilderness, did he keep crossing paths with a creature that had every right to roam these woods in peace? As the bear lifted its nose to the wind, an inexplicable wave of guilt washed over him. He wasn't the only one with a claim to solitude here. Then, in a moment almost too surreal to register, the bear's eyes met his. Even from a distance, Lucas felt the intensity of that gaze. It was like looking into a raw embodiment of nature. No malice, just existence. A primal living force that survived day to day. Lightning illuminated the bear's silhouette for a second, the thunder following close behind. Rain hammered the stony ground between them. In the next flash of lightning, the clearing was empty. The bear had disappeared. Feeling as though he'd been granted a small reprieve, Lucas retreated deeper into the rock alcove, shivering. His clothes were wet, and the temperature was dropping. He realized he should gather firewood or try to set up a makeshift barrier to keep out the wind, but he was too exhausted to move. He closed his eyes, telling himself he'd just rest them for a moment. Sleep claimed him before he knew it. He awoke to a world transformed. Snow blanketed the ground outside, and a fine layer of frost clung to the edges of his jacket. The storm had turned to a light flurry, swirling in gentle eddies around him. A pang of alarm spurred him awake. Early autumn snowfall in Glacier wasn't unheard of, but he wasn't fully prepared for a sudden shift to winter conditions. Shaking off the stiffness in his limbs, he emerged from the rocky shelter. His breath plumed in the icy air. He needed to get to lower ground, find an established trail, maybe return to his car. But which direction? The cloud cover obscured any hints of the sun. The day felt dim and lifeless, as if the storm had snuffed out the vibrancy of the land. He rummaged through his pack, counting the bare essentials. His supplies were dangerously low: 1 can of beans, half a bag of jerky, a few protein bars, and the questionable can of peaches. Not nearly enough if he got lost out here. Navigating by guesswork, he set off, boots crunching through the thin crust of snow. The terrain was slippery, hidden rocks threatening to twist an ankle. A sense of urgency hummed under his skin. Despite that, he couldn't help noticing the stark beauty around him. Snow-laden branches bent gracefully, and icicles formed elegant daggers from boughs. The hush was absolute. No sign of other hikers, no rustling animals. Even the wind was subdued. He pushed on for hours, his legs growing heavier, his breathing labored in the thin, cold air. Part of him regretted not turning back days earlier. He had wanted to test his limits, to challenge his fears. But now, he wasn't just wrestling with emotional burdens. He was contending with nature's raw power. As if on cue, the wind picked up, flinging tiny, stinging snow crystals against his face. The temperature plunged again. The day wore on in a grim grey trek. His water bottle froze at the edges. He had to keep it tucked close to his body to keep it from icing completely. Thoughts of warmth, of home, of a heater blasting in a cozy living room tormented his mind. He was so focused on putting one foot in front of the other that he almost didn't notice the sound at first, a faint, muffled crack. He froze, peering through the swirl of snow. Another crack, closer this time. Instinct told him something was off. Was there a predator near, or was it just the shifting of branches under the snow? Cautiously he advanced, heart pounding. The land before him sloped downward to what looked like a partially frozen creek. He could see a shape in the snow, partially obscured by low-hanging pine limbs. As he drew nearer, he realized with a shock that it was the same bear, its massive bulk covered with a dusting of snow, one foreleg stuck in some twisted contraption. He inched forward, ignoring every survival instinct telling him to keep a wide berth from an injured grizzly. A steel trap illegal in the park had clamped around the bear's paw. Blood matted the fur around the cruel jaws of the trap. The bear panted heavily, letting out throaty whimpers that cut through Lucas's soul. Every so often it lunged and writhed, trying to free itself, but the chain was secured to a stake hidden under the snow. Lucas's breath came in ragged gasps. Here was a creature that had haunted his nights, invaded his solitude, and yet now it was splayed out in front of him, trapped and suffering. What should he do? The safest option was to back away, to slip unnoticed into the trees, but the memory of his mother's words echoed in his mind. Did he have it in him to leave a living being in agony? His body trembled with adrenaline, heart pounding. He carefully dropped his pack, rummaging for something he could use. The bear was enormous, easily twice his weight, and in pain it could kill him with a single swipe if spooked. He found the bear spray, clipped it to his belt, and then took out a collapsible metal baton he used for clearing brush. Slowly, oh so slowly, he approached. The bear growled when it sensed him, snapping its jaws. Fierce, wild eyes burned with pain and suspicion. Lucas stopped a few yards away, speaking in a low, calm voice, though his heart hammered. "Hey there," he said, voice trembling. "I'm not going to hurt you. Could a bear even comprehend such words?" Closer, step by shaking step. The trap's metal jaws were rusted, probably left by some poacher or illegal fur trapper who had long since abandoned it. "Easy," he repeated, forcing his voice to stay steady. Each time the bear growled and lunged, Lucas froze. Gradually, though, the creature seemed to realize that he wasn't advancing to attack. He reached the chain. His fingers were half numb from the cold as he began to scrape away the snow. The stake was driven deep into the ground. He tugged, but it wouldn't budge. A fleeting panic seized him. If he freed the chain, the bear could lunge at him. But seeing the raw wound on the bear's paw spurred him on. He jammed the baton under the stake, leveraging it with all his strength. The bear roared and flailed, yanking on the trap. Lucas jumped back, barely keeping his nerve. The baton snapped, a piece clattering uselessly across the snow. Desperate, he grabbed a heavy rock and started pounding at the metal stake. With every blow, the sound reverberated through the clearing, blending with the bear's guttural cries. He wasn't sure if he was more terrified for himself or heartbroken for the animal. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the stake bent, loosened, and popped free. The chain rattled, but the bear was still trapped by the metal jaws around its paw. Shaking, Lucas assessed the situation. He'd have to get close to the bear's paw to pry the trap open. One miscalculation and he could be mauled, but he couldn't leave it half free. The chain was still restricting the animal's movement, which could cause it more pain and panic. Summoning every ounce of courage, he approached from the side. The bear lifted its massive head, teeth bared in a menacing snarl. Lucas murmured words. He didn't even register, some combination of comfort and apology. With trembling hands, he tapped the mechanism of the trap, searching for the release lever. Rust caked every surface. The bear tensed. Lucas fumbled with the lever, pressing as hard as he could. A sharp click, and the jaws loosened. The bear let out a roar that made Lucas's ears ring. He stumbled backward, losing balance, landing hard on the snow. The trap fell away from the bear's paw. For a moment, they both lay there, Lucas on his back, chest heaving, and the bear sprawled out with blood-streaked fur. Slowly, the bear rose on 3 legs, favoring the injured one. Lucas prepared himself to scramble away, bear spray at the ready. If it charged, he had mere seconds. But the bear didn't charge. It looked at him, panting, a mixture of pain and something else shining in its eyes. Then, with laborious effort, the giant creature limped toward the shelter of nearby trees. Lucas stayed absolutely still, heart hammering in his throat. He watched as the bear disappeared into the swirling snow. He let out a shaky exhale, still gripping the bear spray. A wave of relief and exhaustion crashed over him. His eyes welled with tears, partly from adrenaline, partly from the emotional weight of what had just happened. He had done something monumental, risking himself to save a creature he'd once feared as an enemy. It felt like a piece of himself had cracked open, revealing a raw tenderness underneath. The daylight was waning, and cold seeped into his bones. He packed his gear, every motion slow and deliberate. If the bear returned, or if there were others around, he needed to be on guard. Sinking deeper into the forest felt risky, but staying in that spot with blood in the snow was worse. He walked on, feeling physically and emotionally drained. The next few days blurred in a haze of exhaustion and confusion. He tried to navigate east, judging by the faint arcs of sunlight whenever it peeked through the clouds. The snow didn't relent, turning the trails into an indistinguishable blanket of white. He wasn't sure where he was anymore, a labyrinth of pines and ice. His food supplies diminished rapidly. He managed to catch a trout in a partially thawed stream once, eating it cooked over a pitiful fire. That alone saved him from debilitating hunger. At night, he dreamed of the bear. Sometimes it charged at him, jaws gaping. Other times he saw it guiding him through the woods, massive shoulders forging a path. He would wake disoriented, not sure what was real and what was a product of fatigue. The loneliness weighed heavy, gnawing at the edges of his sanity. By the fourth or fifth day of wandering in the snow, he realized he was running out of time. His body felt weak. Each step became a monumental effort. He rarely saw the sun, and when he did, it was a dim orb behind thick grey clouds. He stumbled over hidden roots and rocks more often than he managed a clear stride. One afternoon, he found a fresh set of tracks, a large animal's prints pressed into the snow. Even with his limited knowledge of tracking, the size told him it could be the same bear. He followed them, half out of desperation. The bear had to know the land better than he did. Perhaps it would lead him closer to water, or lower ground, or anything that could give him a sign of how to get out. The tracks meandered, sometimes crossing streams, other times weaving through dense clusters of evergreens. Lucas pressed on, hardly sure if it was a good idea, but somewhere deep in his gut he felt a flicker of hope. He recalled reading stories of lost hikers rescued by following animal trails to water or roads. Maybe this bear was unknowingly guiding him. His feet were numb, boots damp from trudging through slush and ice. His lips were chapped, and thirst scraped at his throat. He stumbled again, nearly falling face first into the snow. Pushing himself upright, he muttered curses at the cold, at his own foolishness, at the heartbreak that had led him here. A wave of despair threatened to engulf him. He squeezed his eyes shut, thinking of his mother and her unwavering faith in the possibility of renewal. When he opened them, he noticed something else in the footprints ahead, drops of blood. Not much, but small, dark droplets staining the white snow. The bear's injury. He felt an unexpected twinge of concern. Was it still bleeding from the trap wound? Guilt mingled with dread. If it wasn't healing well, it might be in more danger than ever. Or, more dangerous, if cornered. Another half-hour passed in a slow, agonizing slog. His vision blurred with the onset of hunger and dehydration. Then, through the trees, he spotted a rocky cliffside, perhaps 100 yards away. The footprints led toward it, vanishing around an outcropping. He forced himself to keep going, leaning on a makeshift walking stick he'd carved from a sturdy branch. As he rounded the outcropping, he saw a small cave-like opening set into the cliff. Snow partially obscured the entrance, but a gap remained. The tracks led directly inside. He paused, heart thudding. Entering a bear's den, especially in winter, was practically suicidal, but the alternative was to wander aimlessly, with his strength fading by the minute. At least a cave offered shelter from the howling wind. Steeling himself, he peered into the gloom. The cave was shallower than he'd expected, more like a sheltered recess in the rock. A pungent, musty smell wafted out. The ceiling dripped from melted snow, seeping through cracks. In the faint light, he saw movement in the back corner. The bear. It was curled on its side, breathing in ragged gasps. The fur around its paw looked matted and infected. At the sight of Lucas, the bear let out a weak snarl but didn't rise. Lucas swallowed hard. This was insane, yet a strange compulsion drove him forward. He entered the cave slowly, pressing his back against the wall, inching sideways to keep maximum distance. The bear struggled to lift its head, baring teeth, but it was too weak to stand. It snarled again, but the growl ended in a distressed whine. Lucas's heart twisted at the sound. He slid down to a crouch, rummaging through his pack. He had little left to offer, no medical kit. But he did have a bottle of disinfectant meant for small cuts, some gauze, and a thermal blanket. The practicality of trying to bandage a grizzly bear's paw was beyond dubious, but the wound looked terrible, swollen and oozing. He risked a slow approach, singing nonsense under his breath to keep the bear aware of his presence. The smell of infection hit him like a blow. He gagged but pressed forward. The bear tried to swat at him, but it was a feeble motion, more a desperate attempt to keep him away than a real attack. Lucas set down the disinfectant bottle within reach. "I'm sorry," he whispered, feeling tears prick his eyes. He had no idea if the bear recognized him from the trap encounter, but a part of him believed it did. He poured a little disinfectant onto the ragged edges of the wound. The bear let out an agonized roar, thrashing. Lucas leaped back, nearly stumbling into the cave wall. His heart was in his throat, sweat beading despite the cold. After a tense moment, the bear calmed, panting heavily. Lucas offered a silent apology and continued. He doused more disinfectant, grimacing at the sight of pus and clotted blood. With trembling hands, he pressed gauze against the wound. He wrapped the thermal blanket around the bear's torso, not sure if it helped, but wanting to provide some warmth. Minutes passed in a blur of frantic, makeshift nursing. Lucas felt reckless, terrified. But seeing the bear's pain cut through his fear, he thought of his mother's last moments again, the helplessness of watching someone he loved slip away. Now, here he was, kneeling beside a wounded bear, doing everything in his meager power to keep it alive. The strange parallels struck him with a force he never could anticipated. Finally, he slumped back, drenched in sweat. The bear lay there, eyeing him with a mixture of wariness and exhaustion. The infection might still be too advanced. There was little else he could do. He curled up near the cave wall, shivering from cold, his own body on the verge of collapse. He drifted in and out of consciousness, images swirling, his mother's face, the trap, the hospital beeping, the roar of the bear. Night fell. The cave grew darker, save for the weak moonlight filtering through the entrance. Occasionally, the bear would stir, letting out a low groan. Lucas forced himself awake, every muscle aching. He reached for his pack, rummaging for food. He found the can of peaches. Desperate for sustenance, he pried it open, gulping the syrup. Some primal instinct told him he should share. Slowly, he poured a bit of the syrup near the bear's snout. It sniffed, then lapped at the sugary liquid, its dark eyes flickering in the moonlight. There they were, man and beast, battered and alone, sharing a moment of solace. It was almost too surreal to process. Exhaustion wrapped around Lucas like a heavy blanket. He sank deeper into a half-doze, too tired to care about the risks. Through a haze, he felt the cave's cold floor beneath him, the dampness creeping into his clothes. He tried to keep vigil, but finally sleep took him, lulled by the bear's measured breathing. The next morning, he awoke to find the bear still alive, though clearly weak. Its breathing had steadied. He dared to approach, checking the bandage. The gauze was soaked in fluids. He replaced it with strips from the thermal blanket. It was a pitiful excuse for wound care, but it was all he had. Days merged into a cycle of dawn and dusk as the storm raged on outside. Lucas couldn't muster the energy to leave the cave. He was half delirious from hunger, rummaging for anything he could eat. Occasionally, he melted snow to drink. The bear seemed to improve marginally enough to shift positions, grunt in pain, and fix him with a wary look. Sometimes it would lick at the melting snow on the cave floor. Other times it merely slept. Lucas felt his body weakening. He had lost track of how long they'd been in the cave. 3 days. 4? The notion of rescue felt distant, almost absurd. He hadn't seen another human for weeks. No one knew exactly where he was. He thought about writing a last note in his battered notebook, leaving behind some words for whoever might find his remains. Yet an odd sense of peace settled over him too. He was no longer running from himself. The swirl of regrets and fears that had dogged him felt muted. He had found a sense of purpose in caring for this wounded animal, forging a connection that transcended words. In a world stripped down to survival, all the trivialities of modern life, his heartbreak, his insecurities, his anger seemed small. One afternoon, during a lull in the snowfall, the bear managed to stand. It wobbled on 3 paws, the injured one held gingerly off the ground. Its gaze swept over Lucas, who was curled up against the wall, startled to see the animal so close. For a tense moment, they regarded each other. Lucas's pulse pounded. The bear could easily end him now if it felt threatened or hungry, but something in the bear's eyes stopped him from recoiling. The bear snuffled the air, then nudged Lucas's outstretched leg gently. Lucas felt tears prick his eyes again. It wasn't a gesture of aggression, more like an acknowledgement. Something in that moment shifted, as though a silent understanding passed between them. Lucas swallowed, mouth dry. He reached out, hand trembling, stopping a few inches from the bear's muzzle. He expected it to pull away, but it didn't. Instead, the bear huffed softly, then settled back onto its haunches, laying its head down. Lucas exhaled, feeling a rush of gratitude that nearly overwhelmed him. He realized he needed to make a plan. If he didn't find real food or a path out, they would both starve. The snow had eased slightly, the wind less fierce. Perhaps he could venture outside, look for small game, or gather pine nuts, any source of calories. Summoning a last reserve of energy, he rose, staggering on shaky legs. He nodded at the bear as if to say, "I'll be back." It watched him with half-lidded eyes. Outside, the world glittered with fresh snow. The storm's wake looked eerily calm. Patches of clear sky revealed a pale sun. He pushed his way through thigh-deep drifts, scanning for tracks or any sign of movement. The forest was nearly silent, but occasionally he saw a flutter of birds in the treetops. He trudged onward, making mental notes of landmarks to avoid getting lost. Fortune smiled upon him when he spotted a rabbit nibbling at some exposed bark. He steadied himself, heart racing. He had no bow, no proper trap. Desperate, he remembered the baton had snapped, but he still had a small hunting knife. Slowly, he crouched behind a fallen log. The rabbit's ears twitched. Timing his move, he lunged, throwing the knife in a wild attempt. The blade missed by inches, and the rabbit bolted. Deflated, he retrieved his knife, cursing under his breath. Still, he pressed on, forging deeper into the woods. Time stretched, and a dull ache clawed at his stomach. Just as he was about to give up and turn back, he glimpsed a cluster of red berries on a bush. They looked like high-bush cranberries, edible, but bitter. Carefully, he gathered what he could, tasting one to confirm it wasn't poisonous. The tartness bit at his tongue, but it was sustenance. He decided to push a bit further before returning to the cave. Another stroke of luck. He stumbled upon a half-frozen stream where small fish flitted in the shallows. Breaking the thin ice, he tried to scoop them out with a makeshift net of his jacket sleeve. After several failed attempts, he managed to catch 2 tiny fish. It wasn't much, but it was life-giving protein. Exhausted and freezing, he wrapped them in a cloth and headed back. Upon returning to the cave, he found the bear awake, its ears perked. He spread out the fish and berries. He ate one fish raw, grimacing at the taste, then offered the other to the bear. It sniffed the small fish, then licked it up, chewing slowly. The berries he set aside for later. A bizarre camaraderie settled in a mutual struggle for survival that blurred the line between man and beast. Days slipped by, and each one was a battle. Lucas scrounged for food in short bursts. He cleaned the bear's wound, applying what little disinfectant he had left, using fresh snowmelt to wash away infection. Gradually, he saw signs of healing. The redness receded, and while the paw remained swollen, it looked less dire. He told himself stories out loud, sometimes recounting childhood memories, old dreams he once had of becoming an artist. Anything to stay tethered to hope. One afternoon, the sun emerged in full force for the first time in weeks. Rays of light spilled across the snow, and a gentle warmth teased the edges of the frozen landscape. Lucas ventured to a vantage point near the cave, climbing a rocky slope that allowed him to see beyond the immediate forest. The sight filled him with cautious optimism. In the distance, he saw what could be the silhouette of a ranger station or an old cabin. It looked small and weather-worn, but there was a clear, man made shape in the terrain. Clutching his walking stick, he half slid back down to the cave to check on the bear. It was awake, standing gingerly on its injured paw, testing the weight. Lucas felt a surge of pride, like a caretaker watching a patient take their first steps after a long illness. He knelt down, letting the bear sniff his outstretched hand. It rumbled softly, not exactly a purr, but something akin to relief or acceptance. That was when he made a decision. He had to try for that structure. If it was empty, maybe it still had some supplies. If it wasn't empty, perhaps the occupant park rangers or researchers could help them both. But traveling with a bear at his side seemed impossible, not to mention absurd. Still, he felt a pang at the thought of leaving the animal behind, even temporarily. Would the bear follow him? Would it even understand? He gathered his meager belongings, packing them carefully. Then he walked to the cave entrance, beckoning to the bear as if summoning a trusted companion. The bear sniffed, cocked its head, and limped closer. Lucas could hardly believe what he was about to attempt. "Come on, buddy," he said, voice quavering. "Let's get out of here." He stepped onto the snow. The bear followed, wincing with each step on its injured paw. Lucas guided them toward the vantage point, taking the path of least resistance through the drifts. It was a slow process, fraught with danger if the bear suddenly panicked or if they encountered a steep drop. Yet the bear stayed close, as if it too recognized that staying put meant certain starvation. In the midday sun, they reached the rocky outcrop. Lucas pointed toward the distant silhouette, though he knew the bear couldn't understand gestures in a human sense. But it stared in that direction, nose twitching in the breeze. With the clarity of daylight, Lucas saw a faint line of smoke rising from the structure. Relief soared in his chest. Smoke meant fire, and fire meant people, possibly a lifeline. They pressed onward. The going was rough. The bear's injury slowed them, and Lucas had to pause frequently to catch his breath. At times, he worried that traveling with an apex predator would terrify anyone they encountered. But the alternative, leaving the bear behind, felt unthinkable now. The terrain dipped into a wooded valley, then rose sharply again. Sunlight wavered. Clouds moved in, but they weren't heavy with snow this time. By late afternoon, they were close enough to see that the structure was indeed a small cabin. Smoke curled from a tin chimney pipe, the scent of wood smoke carrying on the breeze. It triggered a memory of winter nights at his childhood home, a warm stove, his mother baking bread, laughter echoing off wooden walls. Lucas's heart fluttered with a sudden fear of rejection, or worse. What if the cabin's occupant saw the bear and shot first, asked questions later? He didn't want the bear to be hurt, especially after all they had endured. He inched forward, the bear trailing behind. He could make out a short wooden porch and snowshoes propped against the door. Approaching cautiously, he cupped his hands around his mouth, calling out, "Hello?" No immediate response. He tried again, a bit louder. Then the cabin door creaked open, revealing a man with greyish hair and a lined face. His expression went from curiosity to alarm as soon as he spotted the bear behind Lucas. "Wait!" Lucas shouted, hands up in a surrendering motion. "Don't shoot! It's wounded. We need help." The man's hand hovered near a hunting rifle, leaning against the doorframe. His eyes flicked between Lucas and the bear, tension etched in every muscle. For a few agonizing seconds, Lucas feared the worst. But then the man lowered his hand, perhaps seeing the desperation in Lucas's eyes or the weakened state of the bear. He stepped onto the porch, voice grave. "Who are you, and what in God's name are you doing out here with that thing?" Lucas swallowed. "My name's Lucas," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "Got lost in the storm, found the bear caught in a trap, freed it. We both of us could use some help." The man frowned, scanning the area as if expecting an ambush. Then he sighed deeply, the lines in his face softening. "I'm Clint," he said. "Ranger, retired. Come inside before you freeze. But that bear, not sure how this is going to work." Lucas nodded. He turned to the bear, which eyed the porch warily. Slowly, he guided it closer, letting Clint see the makeshift bandages. The old ranger's gruff manner shifted to concern. He stepped off the porch, ignoring Lucas's warning glance, and approached the bear. He moved like someone who understood animals, at least more than the average person. With surprising gentleness, he touched the bandage. The bear tensed but didn't snap. Clint met Lucas's eyes. "You did this?" Lucas nodded, heart racing. "It was trapped. Tried my best to keep it from dying." The ranger let out a long breath, nodding slowly. "Incredible," he muttered. "All right. Let's see if we can get it patched up better. There's a lean-to behind the cabin. Might be enough shelter for the bear. Got some leftover meds from my years in the field too." In a daze of relief, Lucas helped guide the bear around to the lean-to, a simple three-sided structure stacked with firewood. The bear settled on a bed of straw Clint hastily arranged, while the ranger rummaged for supplies. Over the next hour, they disinfected the wound more thoroughly and applied antibiotic ointment. Clint had a leftover sedation dose meant for large animals, but they decided to avoid it unless absolutely necessary. When they finally finished, Lucas sank onto the porch steps, exhaustion flooding him. Clint handed him a mug of hot tea. The warmth of the steam against his face felt surreal. "You're lucky to be alive," Clint said quietly, stirring his own cup. "That's a grizzly, for crying out loud. Not exactly known for making friends." Lucas gave a weary laugh. "Didn't feel like friends at first. But we kind of saved each other." The old ranger nodded, eyes thoughtful. "I've seen some strange things out here in my time. Mother Nature's got a way of humbling a man." They spoke for a while longer. Lucas recounted his journey, the heartbreak that had driven him here, the chance encounters with the bear. Clint listened, occasionally nodding in understanding. Then the ranger showed him to a cot inside the cabin. "You rest up. We'll see how the bear fares. When you're strong enough, we'll figure out a way to contact the park authorities or get you back to civilization. Might have to radio for a ranger patrol, though I'll have to rig up my antenna again." Lucas thanked him, overwhelmed by gratitude. He lay down, savoring the first real bed he'd had in weeks. Outside, the night sky was clear, stars shining bright. He could almost feel the bear's presence in the lean-to, sleeping off the months of fear and pain. In the days that followed, Lucas regained his strength under Clint's watchful care. They shared meals of canned goods and dried staples. Clint was stoic but kind, a man who had chosen solitude after losing his wife years ago. Lucas recognized a kindred spirit, someone who also understood the aching need to step away from the world. Meanwhile, the bear continued to heal, regaining some energy and weight from the scraps. Clint provided mostly fish and leftover stew broth. One crisp morning, Lucas ventured outside to find the bear standing at the edge of the clearing, testing its injured paw on the snow. He approached slowly, noticing that the swelling had gone down considerably. Their eyes met, and he sensed it might be time for the bear to return to its natural habitat. They had found an unexpected bond, but the wild called to the bear. It had never truly been his to keep. It took a few steps, pausing to look back at him. Lucas could almost sense the silent farewell. Then, with lumbering grace, the bear ambled into the trees. Lucas watched until it disappeared from sight. A strange sense of loss and triumph warred in his chest. Tears blurred his vision. He realized that he felt more alive than he had in a long time. Despite all the pain, the isolation, the danger, he had connected with something bigger than himself, a living emblem of the wilderness, and, in a sense, his own heart. Later that day, Clint helped him set up the radio antenna. Crackling static soon gave way to a faint voice. They arranged for a park ranger patrol to meet them at a trailhead, a couple of days' hike away once the snow cleared further. Lucas knew he could probably call for a helicopter evacuation, but he felt a pull to complete the journey on foot, somehow a symbolic end to the odyssey he had started. As he gathered his belongings, preparing to leave, Clint clasped his shoulder. "I hope you find what you're looking for out there," he said. Lucas smiled, feeling a lightness in his chest. "I think I already have," he replied. They parted ways near the edge of the clearing. Lucas trekked east toward the designated meeting spot, the sun shining on the pristine snow. Along the way, he caught himself scanning the forest, half hoping to see that familiar silhouette again. Part of him believed the bear was watching from a distance, ensuring that he made it out safely. 3 days later, he emerged onto a gravel road where a park ranger SUV waited. The rangers greeted him with relief and incredulity. They'd had reports of a missing hiker weeks ago, but the storm made any search nearly impossible. As they drove him back toward the ranger station, Lucas stared out the window, overwhelmed by the civilization he was slowly re-entering. Yet he felt no dread, only a renewed sense of purpose. He would carry this story with him always. The tale of fear transformed into respect, hostility replaced by empathy. In saving the bear, he had, in many ways, saved himself. Nature had broken him open, forcing him to confront not only his physical limits, but the deeper wounds he carried. And in that brokenness, he found growth, connection, and the resilience he needed to move forward. As he left Glacier National Park behind, he realized that he was returning home a different man, one who had witnessed the raw power of the wild and learned that sometimes the things we fear the most hold the key to our salvation. The story of Lucas and the bear is a testament to how life's most terrifying challenges can become the catalysts for our greatest transformation. In the face of isolation, loss, and a near-fatal winter storm, Lucas found a path to healing both for himself and for a wounded animal that once symbolized his deepest fears. This unlikely friendship shows that compassion knows no boundaries, not even those dividing man from beast. The lessons learned on that snowy mountainside underscore our shared vulnerability and resilience, reminding us that hope can burn bright, even in the coldest of storms. If this story touched your heart and sparked your imagination, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Let's spread the message of connection and compassion far and wide, and remember, the next time you face the wilderness within or without, embrace the possibility that an unexpected friend might just be waiting to help you find your way home.